now from the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., a discussion on the life of journalist H.L. Mencken. You'll hear from Terry Teachout, author of The Skeptic. The lecture is about 1 hour.
See myself seated on a platform next to P.J. O'Rourke, I know not to try any funny stuff. So I'll leave the punchlines to him. Sooner or later, usually sooner, anyone who proposes to write a book about H.L. Mencken finds his way to the top floor of the main branch of the Enoch Pratt Free Library in downtown Baltimore. On that floor is a room with a bright blue door, and behind that door are most of the private papers of a vain and brilliant pack rat. Mencken thought so well of himself that he started subscribing to a clipping service at the age of 23. And he preserved for the edification of future generations of scholars, among many, many other things, his school books, his doctor's bills, and all his canceled checks. Thanks to Mencken's vanity, or foresight, the Mencken Room also houses more than 200 scrapbooks containing every newspaper and magazine article written about H.L. Mencken since 1903. The earliest clippings were dated and pasted into those books by Mencken himself. I've read them all, or at least laid eyes on every page, which isn't quite the same thing. Still, I probably know as much about what other people thought of Mencken and wrote about him as anybody alive. And one thing I've noticed is that since 1956, the year he died, an amazingly high percentage of the clippings in the Mencken scrapbooks are what I call IMWATs. That's short for If Mencken Were Alive Today, IMWAT. It's a literary form as strict as a sonnet. First, the author describes some current outrage against common sense. That is, his version of common sense. Then, in quick succession, he imagines the scalding things Mencken might have had to say about it, cites a few other recent and similar offenses, suggests the world would be a better place, IMWAT, then closes by remarking that no modern-day newspaper would dare hire so politically incorrect a columnist. I saw a near-perfect example of an IMWAT last week, the first paragraph of the Washington Post review of The Skeptic, written by Richard Lingemann, Theodore Dreiser's biographer and a senior editor of The Nation, who, rather to my surprise, liked my book. Lingemann wrote, "What if by some devilish miracle the great 1920s iconoclast H.L. Mencken were resurrected and writing today? Who'd be the targets of his cynical wit? Jerry Falwell? John Ashcroft? Ken Lay and the Enron Gang? George W. Bush? Oh well, it's a pleasant thought." And there you have it, the quintessence of IMWAT. One of the reasons IMWATs are so easy to write is because Mencken was so incredibly prolific. Between 1910 and 1941, he turned out at least one opinion column every week. As a result, anyone passably familiar with his work can knock together an IMWAT stuffed with quotations that have an unnervingly contemporary ring. I place in evidence this little rhapsody about the American politician, written in 1926. He is a man who has lied and dissembled, and a man who has crawled. He knows the taste of the boot polish. He has suffered kicks in the tonneau of his pantaloons. He has taken orders from his superiors in knavery, and he has wooed and flattered his inferiors in sense. His public life is an endless series of evasions and false pretenses. He is willing to embrace any issue, however idiotic, that will get him votes, and he is willing to sacrifice any principle, however sound, that will lose them for him. I do not describe the Democratic politician at his inordinate worst. I describe him as he is encountered in the full sunshine of normalcy. He may be, on the one hand, a crossroads idler striving to get into the state legislature by grace of the local mortgage sharks and evangelical clergy, or he may be, on the other, President of the United States. It is almost an axiom that no man may make a career in politics in the Republic without stooping to such ignobility. It is as necessary as a loud voice. Like I said, it's easy. Too easy, in fact, because there is something about Mencken that we have a way of forgetting. He is not our contemporary. We forget that because he sounds so very contemporary, not just in tone, but quite often in subject matter as well. Kenneth Tynan, the English drama critic, once paid a lovely tribute to Noel Coward. He said, "Even the youngest of us will know in 50 years' time exactly what we mean by a very Noel Coward sort of person." Well, Tynan wrote those words exactly 50 years ago, and sure enough, he was right. We do. H.L. Mencken died 46 years ago, the week before I was born, as a matter of fact. And today, a half-century later, you can take it pretty much for granted that any literate American will know just what you mean by a very H.L. Mencken sort of essay. What he'll probably have in mind is something like, maybe The Husbandman, a little editorial about the American farmer that Mencken wrote for the third issue of The American Mercury, the magazine he co-founded in 1924. This is how it starts. "Let the farmer, so far as I am concerned, be damned forevermore. To hell with him and bad luck to him. He is a tedious fraud and ignoramus, a cheap rogue and hypocrite, the eternal jack of the human pack. He deserves all that he ever suffers under our economic system and more. Any city man, not insane, who sheds tears for him is shedding tears of the crocodile." See what I mean? Of course you do. I can tell from the smiles on your faces. Nobody else could have written that paragraph, and anybody who knows anything about American literature would have guessed who wrote it. With a few minor changes, it would sound perfectly fresh were you to see it on the op-ed page of tomorrow morning's paper. And yet, that freshness is an illusion, for we are as far removed from the world of Mencken's youth as he was from the world of George Washington. He was born in 1880, 10 months before Billy the Kid was shot, the same year Edison invented the electric light bulb. He finished his schooling, went to work, and began to publish before the close of the 19th century. He once told a reporter that the only modern innovations he truly appreciated were the typewriter and the Pullman sleeper. He never flew on an airplane, and for most of his life, he never drove a car, never went to the movies, never listened to the radio, and used the telephone as seldom as possible. I shudder to think what he would have thought of email. Not only was Mencken a man entirely of his own time and place, he was far more complicated than many people realize, including some of his biggest fans. On the surface, he was the clearest and most confident of writers, a paragon of self-assurance. In 1930, he was invited to contribute his personal credo to a symposium whose other participants included Albert Einstein, John Dewey, H.G. Wells, and Bertrand Russell. Being a journalist, and thus accustomed to writing short, he got the whole of it into these 3 crisp sentences. "I believe that it is better to tell the truth than to lie. I believe that it is better to be free than to be a slave. And I believe that it is better to know than to be ignorant." That is a credo without shadows or second thoughts. No one but an American, and no other American, could have written it. And yet it doesn't come close to telling the whole story of H.L. Mencken. He was, as editorial writers like to say of themselves, often wrong, but never in doubt. But the surface consistency of his beliefs was a theatrical illusion, produced by the self-assured crackle of his prose. This came as a great surprise to me, and I knew more about Mencken than most people do when I started writing The Skeptic. I took it for granted, for example, that he would be easy to place on the political spectrum, that he was the pre-war equivalent, more or less, of what we now call libertarian. But as I looked more closely at his writings, especially what he wrote prior to World War I came to see that he didn't quite fit so easily into that pigeonhole. For the only state about which he ever wrote with outright admiration was the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm. In 1914, Mencken wrote an essay about Germany, in which he described it as a delimited aristocratic democracy in the Athenian sense, a democracy of intelligence, of strength, of superior fitness, a new aristocracy of the laboratory, the study, and the shop. That was Mencken's idea of a really good state. And having come to the conclusion that Germany was that state and was everything America was not, he proceeded to say so repeatedly in his newspaper columns, assuring the citizens of Baltimore that German notions of what is good and bad, what is right and wrong, what is effective and ineffective will prevail in the world. That was the unlikely conclusion he had drawn from his extensive but superficial reading of Nietzsche. He had come to believe in the Victorian idea of progress, only with a German accent. Now, how did Mencken reconcile his admiration for an authoritarian state like Wilhelmine Germany, oft-stated belief in liberty up to the extreme limits of the feasible and tolerable? Well, for him, there was nothing to reconcile. He explained it this way. Liberty, of course, is not for slaves. I do not advocate inflicting it on men against their conscience. But this was an intellectual sleight of hand and did nothing to resolve the contradiction. So, was Mencken being disingenuous when he later claimed to be strongly in favor of what he called the sort of free democracy visualized by Jefferson? Or had he simply not thought the thing through? It's impossible to say, though we know he was not a liberal, by which he and the rest of his generation meant what is now known in American political parlance as a classical liberal. We know it because he said so on numerous occasions. In 1923, for example, he confessed himself to be unable to make the grade as a liberal. Liberalism always involves freeing human beings against their will, often, indeed, to their obvious damage, as in the cases of the majority of Negroes and women. On another occasion, he defined a liberal as one who was willing to believe anything twice. Of course, Mencken wasn't a political scientist, nor does he appear to have read at all widely in the classics of political philosophy, and intellectual consistency was never his strong suit. It could be that he thought Jeffersonian democracy was the best America could hope for, or that it was the necessary precondition for the emergence of a German-style democracy of strength. And it is also possible that he simply changed his mind as he grew older. Certainly, he was deeply disillusioned by what happened to Germany after World War I, and said so in print. But the point is that if you look to Mencken for consistency, if you take what he wrote in 1922 and apply it directly to the America of 2002, you may be in for an unpleasant surprise. This is the reason why I don't much care for IMWATs and don't write them myself. I think I know what Mencken would have thought about a great many things if he were alive today. I think, for instance, that he would have been very strongly opposed to going to war with Iraq, not because he was a pacifist, but because he was an old-fashioned isolationist who thought America should mind its own business. He thought we should have stayed out of World War II, and he said so in a way that many Americans would find shocking today. Here's a typical example, a private memo, not for publication, probably written in 1945 or 46, and preserved in a file in the closet of the Mencken room. I find it difficult to work up any regret for the heroes butchered in World War II. Anyone silly enough to believe in such transparent quacks as Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill leaves the world little the loser by departing from it. Now, I happen to think that is dreadful stuff, possibly the most odious thing Mencken ever wrote in a long life devoted to giving offense. But am I absolutely sure that it helps us to understand what he would have thought of George W. Bush if he were alive today? No. His mind didn't work in that systematic kind of way, and because it didn't, it's difficult to take him seriously as a political thinker. And yet, Mencken still matters, very much so. Most of his major books are in print, and new collections of his essays continue to be published, read, and quoted. Earlier this year, Richard Posner brought out a book in which he surfed the web to see which public intellectuals had been most frequently cited there between 1995 and 2000. Mencken was the 6th most cited dead intellectual. Fewer times than George Bernard Shaw, George Orwell, H.G. Wells, Timothy Leary, and C.S. Lewis, but more times than W.H. Auden, Bertolt Brecht, Allen Ginsberg, John Maynard Keynes, Lillian Hellman, Marshall McLuhan, Ayn Rand, or Jean-Paul Sartre. And if I may put on my pop culture hat for a moment, Mencken actually turned up on TV just a few weeks ago on an episode of the WB sitcom Gilmore Girls. A friend of mine happened to be watching that night, and another friend found the script on the web and sent it to me. One of the characters on the show says, "I have a surprise. Not only did I find that copy of Mencken's Chrestomathy that we discussed, I also found a first edition of his memoirs as well. It's in my office if you'd like to see them." And his grandchild replies, "Oh my God, I totally would." Now, I ask you, how many other major American writers have been anointed as totally cool by the WB? More to the point, what other American journalist of the 20s continues to be not only read, but relished? Just one. So why is it that we still wonder what Mencken would think in what? Why do we still read what he wrote about Franklin and Teddy Roosevelt and Calvin Coolidge and William Jennings Bryan? Part of the reason, maybe the biggest part, is that he was mainly interested not in individual politicians or even in politics as such, but in the American national character. For him, America was the land in which Puritanism is constantly at war with hedonism and, analogously, collectivism with individualism. And his great achievement as a social critic was to isolate and dramatize this struggle in a permanently memorable way. Mencken's hatred of Puritanism, and hatred is not too strong a word, it's the word he used, is at the heart of his critique of American life. He once spoke of the whole Puritan scheme of things, with its gross and nauseating hypocrisies, its idiotic theologies, its moral obsessions, its pervasive Philistinism. All these things he took to be intrinsic to America's collective personality. Theologies and ideologies come and go, but the conceptions of human nature from which they spring are forever with us. And to leaf through Mencken's work is to be struck by how often, as he bashed away at long-forgotten manifestations of the Puritan culture of the 20s, he said things scarcely less applicable, though in a very different way, to America today, like this. In the United States, there is a right way to think and a wrong way to think in everything. Not only in theology or politics or economics, but in the most trivial matters of everyday life. Thus, in the average American city, the citizen who, in the face of an organized public clamor for the erection of an equestrian statue of Susan B. Anthony in front of the chief railway station, or the purchase of a dozen leopards for the municipal zoo, or the dispatch of an invitation to the Structural Iron Workers Union to hold its next annual convention in the town Symphony Hall, the citizen who, for any logical reason, opposes such a proposal, on the grounds, say, that Miss Anthony never rode a horse in her life, or that a dozen leopards would be less useful than a gallows to hang the city council, or that the structural iron workers would spit all over the floor of Symphony Hall and knock down the busts of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, this citizen is commonly denounced as an anarchist and a public enemy. It is not only erroneous to think thus, it has come to be immoral. I should add that he wrote those words in 1921. To some extent, Mencken's survival is a triumph of style, but he was something more than a great stylist, if something less than a truly wise man. However perverse or excessive his underlying ideas may be, they retain, to this day, much of their impelling force. And no matter whether you agree with him about anything at all, you can't help being impressed by the stubborn way in which Mencken, the self-made philosopher, grapples in his unpretentious, take-no-prisoners style with the permanent things, the limits of art, the rule of law, the meaning of life. The simplicity, one comes to realize, is inseparable from the message. In Mencken, style and content are one, and the resulting alloy is more than merely individual. It is a matchlessly exact expression of the American temper. In the 11 years since I started working on The Skeptic, a great many people have asked me something like this. That's a lot of time to spend with anybody, especially a guy like Mencken. Do you still like him? Do you still admire him? Or did you get sick and tired of him? Well, I never got tired of him, though sometimes I got angry with him. Sometimes I asked myself, how could a man so smart have thought so many stupid things? How could he have been so terribly wrong about Jews, about blacks, about World War II? I don't have a simple answer to that question. People write books to answer questions like that, and The Skeptic is my answer, insofar as there is an answer. Do I still like him? Yes, I do, basically. I would have been very glad to have dinner with him, though I'm not sure I'd have wanted to read what he wrote about me in his diary afterwards. For he was a fearfully complicated man, both cold and loving, opportunistic and loyal, foolish and wise, much like the rest of us, only more so. But as for admiring him, the answer is simpler. Not everything about H.L. Mencken was admirable. Some things about him were frightful. Sometimes he's hard to take. Yet there's no getting around him. He is a fact of American life. He was, to the first part of the 20th century, what Mark Twain was to the last part of the 19th, the quintessential voice of American letters. In the city of his birth, he's known as the Sage of Baltimore, a nickname at which I have no doubt he would have smiled. But then, perhaps he was a sage of sorts, though a completely American one, not calm and reflective, but as noisy as a tornado, witty and abrasive, self-confident and self-contradictory, sometimes maddening, often engaging, always inimitable. Definitely a man to have dinner with, and a writer to read for as long as books are read.
Thanks, Terry. When we first knew that Terry was coming here, we cast about in our minds who would be an ideal commentator for this particular book, this particular biography. I'm happy to report to you today that we have in fact engaged the ideal person to talk about Terry's book. P.J. O'Rourke is the author of many books, and he is the Mencken Research Fellow at the Cato Institute. P.J.?
Well, it's very nice of Terry to say that he didn't want to be funny before me, but I know better than to try and be intelligent after him, so I won't try. But the title of H.L. Mencken Fellow, unpaid and worth it, it happens to be something that I, in fact, owe personally to H.L. Mencken. Back in, I think it was 1989, Ed Crane was looking for a way to get me to increase my donation to the Cato Institute from $5 a year to $10 a year or something. And anyway, Mencken's diaries had just been published. And Mencken was at that time, if we cast our mind back, a sort of icon to certain right-wingers in Washington, wrongly, I would say, and Terry would prove. If the editors of the American Spectator had read their Mencken with attention, they never would have published the Vince Foster abducted by space aliens articles that caused that magazine to go kerflooey. Anyway, when the diaries were published, though, the left-wingers were delighted to discover that Mencken privately used the N-word, and the J-word, and even called women ladies. I love this sensitivity to giving linguistic offense from people who gather in Lafayette Square to shout F you, George Bush, through bullhorns. Anyway, so Ed thought, since my whole career is a linguistic offense, that I should be Cato's H.L. Mencken Research Fellow. I believe Mencken deserves better, actually, and now he's received it. He's received it in Terry and in his wonderful book. Mencken is remembered as an iconoclast and a debunker and sort of a permanent kick in the ass to the bourgeoisie proprieties, and a little imwat here. It's a shame that he didn't live into the era of fast food and spandex, because there would be so much more bourgeoisie ass to kick. But Mencken was a lot more than that. He was a pioneer and a revolutionary in American letters, if not in American thought. I mean, first is a pyrotechnic use of a specifically American language. I mean, others before had written in an American idiom, but that idiom was usually folksy, as in the best of Mark Twain and his fellow humorists. Or when the idiom was not folksy, it was baloney, like Henry David Thoreau, or cracked in the head, like Walt Whitman. Mencken invented a style that was both wholly American in its humor and its exuberance, but also fit for the expression of actual ideas and thoughts, even if some of those ideas and thoughts were wrong. But more important than this revolution in style was the revolution in tone that Mencken fathered. He was the first journalist, so far as I know, ever to employ the light touch when covering serious topics. I commend to you his story about a 1917 attempted coup in Cuba that he recounts in Heathen Days as an absolute masterful example of the light touch. And he was also the first reporter to turn a serious eye on the silly. For which his dispatches from the Snopes trial, for which they're justly famous. But most important of all, in the matter of serious and silly, Mencken knew the difference. Now here's an example from his obituary of Calvin Coolidge, which he wrote during the Depression in 1933. Mencken said of Coolidge, he not only said little, and that little of harmless platitudes all compact, but did even less. The kind of government he offered the country was government stripped to the buff. It was government that governed hardly at all. Thus the ideal of Jefferson was realized at last. Coolidge was preceded by one world saver and followed by two more. What enlightened American, having to choose between any of them and another Coolidge, would hesitate for an instant? He had no ideas and he was not a nuisance. When will we see another politician of which that can be said? Making a very sharp eye for pieties, pieties as versus beliefs. You see, pieties are aggressive. In our pieties, we show our desire to walk on the heads of our fellow men, or failing to get on top of them, to pull them down to our level. Consider the difference between pieties and beliefs. Consider the difference between an informed and rational belief that an astronomer might have, that an asteroid is about to hit Earth. And consider the difference between that and a pious assumption that an asteroid will strike Earth. Now, if you believe that this disaster is imminent, you set out to prove the danger, to test your proofs, to convince others by calm and measured arguments that your proofs are true, that your tests are valid, and that therefore a certain informed and rational actions should be taken. You do not found chapters of Mothers Against Asteroids or lobby Congress for laws forbidding asteroids to strike the planet. The tone that Mencken invented, and I would call it, for the lack of the kind of clever phrase that would have rolled from the typewriter of the master, I call it big city smartass. Mencken was present at, as Terry just pointed out, he was present at, we did not coordinate our little talks, so we cover a bit of the same ground here. But Mencken was present at and keenly observant of, and indeed in a front rank leader in the great transformation of America from a country full of apple-knocking yokel hayseeds into a nation of urban Weisenheimers, See, our minds, again, as Terry said, Mencken is so identified with the 1920s that by which time that transformation had largely taken place, that we forget how early it was that Mencken emerged, 1899. He was co-editor of the Smart Set with George G. Nathan beginning in 1908. And I mean, at that time, the members of the Algonquin Roundtable, they were in nursery school, trading such witty quips as you're a boogerhead, I mean, the big city smartass tone that pervades all journalism today was a Mencken invention. That is to say, we have him to thank for Lloyd Grove. And that brings me to the one thing that I truly love about Mencken, that he was wrong rather often. He was wrong about Germany twice in a row, He was very wrong about Theodore Dreiser being a good writer. Mencken's genius was so great that if he hadn't been wrong a lot, it would be insufferable that he'd even ever existed, And as it was, Mencken lived to see the urban smartasses come to power with FDR. And he learned, or at least I hope he learned, that there are worse pieties than those of apple-knocking yokel hayseeds. I am, though, deeply gratified that Mencken was still alive and well, to see FDR pushed up the handicapped access ramps to the gates of hell. It is, to me, Obviously, there are Mencken opinions that one wouldn't care to be a fellow traveler with, but very interesting to me is that Mencken disliked democracy, and all the more in the wake of the New Deal's depredations. Democracy, he wrote, is the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. But what's even more interesting than that to me is the fact that we libertarians, if we're to be truthful with ourselves, also dislike democracy. Not that we'd replace it. I mean, the alternatives to democracy are disgusting. But just because we abhor the oppression of mankind by one person or by a few people is no reason for us to be happy and proud about the oppression of mankind by a plurality of people over the age of 18, not counting votes in Florida. Mencken was acutely aware of this and of the other problems of lawmaking that cause us as libertarians to urge our lawmakers to look upon Calvin Coolidge and be as like him as they can. 72 years ago, Mencken wrote, there is in fact no reason for confusing the people and the legislature. The two are quite distinct. The legislature, like the executive, has ceased, save indirectly, to be even the creature of the people. It is the creature in the main of pressure groups, and most of them, it must be manifest, are of dubious wisdom and even more dubious honesty. Laws are no longer made by rational process of public discussion. I would insert, if indeed they ever were. They are made by a process of blackmail and intimidation, and they are executed in the same manner. The typical lawmaker of today is a man wholly devoid of principle, a mere counter in a grotesque and knavish game. If the right pressure could be applied to him, he would be cheerfully in favor of polygamy, astrology, or cannibalism. Well, Bill Clinton was cheerfully in favor of polygamy. We had astrology in the Reagan White House, and George W. Bush is eating his own kind in the corporate corruption scandals of the moment. So we're 3 for 3 in the just in the past 20 years. Mencken was quite appropriately so-called in the title of Terry's book. He was a skeptic. But this did not make Mencken cynical and bitter as a person. Rather, it made him humorous and indeed, in a way, at least in his personal life, if not his prose, accepting. Mencken embraced the full complexity of the human character, even when he didn't like it very much. And it's something that we advocates of freedom should be sure to remember to do. We support freedom not because men are good, but because individual men, bad as they may be, are pretty amusing, whereas men in mobs, men in gangs, men in Congress are no fun at all. We should not fob off upon the world the notion that if people were perfectly free, people would be perfectly rational, that people would always be full of enlightened self-interest and never full of crap. We owe an enormous debt to Terry Teachout for taking us back to our Mencken. We need to read Mencken to keep ourselves from ever turning into idealists. He denounced idealists at great length, and he was at his very worst when he attempted to be one. And I think he basically said it all about idealism. He said an idealist is one who, on noticing that a rose smells better than a cabbage, concludes that it will also make a better soup. Well, thank you. Oh.
Thanks. As is typical at a Cato book forum, we'll now have a question and answer session for both of our speakers. Please raise your hand, I'll identify you, and then wait for a person to bring you a microphone. And also, please identify yourself and any institutional affiliation you might have. Who would like to ask a question? In the back.
But you did say sort of piqued my curiosity at the end when you said he was at his worst when he was trying to be an idealist, and that sometimes he was an idealist or took a non-skeptical approach to some topics. Could you give us a little bit of a flavor of that?
Well, actually, we were talking about that a bit earlier, that particularly before World War I, when Mencken was when he was writing in a more explicit way about what he imagined as a good state, a state that worked, the state that he idealized was the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm. He wrote very explicitly about this, although it's largely forgotten, and in any attempt to understand his thinking, one has to come to grips with this and what it meant, which I tried to do in the book. He can be a bit of a pulpit pounder at times, and he's at his weakest when he does that. He is that way in a book of prefaces, the book he wrote in 1917 about American literature and American Puritanism. Sometimes, every once in a while, and most particularly on this subject and on the subject of FDR, Mencken could forget to be funny. He could forget to be amused. And when he takes umbrage, he sounds just like anybody else taking umbrage, only with a better vocabulary.
Michael Kelly, the editor of the Atlantic Monthly, also writes a column for the Washington Post, told me the thing that he hated most about Clinton, and he really hates Clinton, was that Clinton made him so angry that he lost his sense of humor, and that would happen to Mencken. I would also say that Mencken is generally at his best when he's criticizing policy or cultural constructs, that when he offers an alternative. This is something you may have noticed around your own house. When he offers an alternative, say, for instance, Christmas, when you denounce it to the children as being over-commercialized, you're on very sound ground. When you attempt to entice the children into replacing it with some sort of Anglo-Saxon version of Kwanzaa, you are on thinner ice.
And as Mencken grew older, he was much less likely to indulge in that sin. I think he realized, perhaps by instinct, perhaps even very consciously, that he wasn't good at thinking through desirable alternatives to that which was bad. That the heart of his art as a writer, and the reason why he's alive for us today, is because he is so stimulating when he is speaking in a purely destructive way about the things he doesn't like.
Other questions?
Chris Grebe. I'm curious, I've seen the movie Inherit the Wind, and I know the E.K. Hornbeck character is obviously based on H.L. Mencken. Is that a fair portrayal of him? That I guess is my question. Is that a fair... About him personally and about the really savage cynicism that E.K. Hornbeck shows in that story.
Well, it's naughty of me to say this, but a boy must peddle his book, and there is a lengthy section of my book which is about the Scopes trial and Mencken's involvement in it, which was quite up to his knees. He was involved with it in a way that would now be regarded as entirely unethical, since he also covered it for the Baltimore Sun. About the Hornbeck characterization, it's clever, and I think I said somewhere in the book that Mencken must be the only great American writer who was portrayed on film by a great American dancer, Gene Kelly. But it's a caricature, just like everything else in Inherit the Wind is a caricature. Inherit the Wind, as I talk about in the book, deviates quite deliberately from anything like a real portrayal of what was happening in the Scopes trial. So it should be taken with a stalactite of salt, I think.
Other questions? In the front row there.
Chris Buckley, congratulations on the book, Terry. It's really wonderful. When the diaries were published about 7-8 years or so ago, I think it was, that was when we first saw Mencken sort of unmasked as a bigot. The N-words, the J-words in particular. How heavily has that cost his reputation in the predictable sectors, in academia, in the left intelligentsia, and has it been effective in deterring and stymieing sales of his books?
Well, those are two completely separate issues. In the first case, it has been quite effective, although even before the publication of the diaries, I would venture to say that Mencken was the least taught of major American writers, and he's scarcely taught at all now. But it hasn't kept his books from selling, even though he is now regarded as something on the order of, is it red kryptonite? But his books sell, they're in print, they sell well. Nobody ever has any difficulty cobbling together a new anthology and finding a publisher for it. Mencken may not be taught, but he's popular. He's popular because he gives pleasure. He's popular for a lot of other reasons, because there's something to him more than the beauty of the style. But the first reason why he's still popular is simply because he's so fun to read. He's awfully hard to resist, unless you are totally humorous, like some of the people that I think you were referring to in your question.
On the aisle.
Who was the other voice from the 1920s you referred to?
What did I say?
You said that there was only one other voice from the 1920s that had lasted as long.
Oh, no, I didn't. I may have misspoken, but what I meant to say was only one, Mencken.
Other questions? Again, in the front row here.
I'm Bill Peterson with the Heritage Foundation as an adjunct. And it seems to me, having read and devoured Notes on Democracy in 1927, which excoriates democracy to the nth degree, he said, in part, it seemed to strike him as a matter of, if not orgasm at one point. In any event, I think there's more to democracy, and I think it's very Hayekian and Cato-esque, and deserves the treatment that I got from my mentor at NYU, namely Ludwig von Mises, that it is a kind of a consumer democracy that we witness in the marketplace. Indeed, Mencken aside, Mises contended we have a market democracy or a consumer democracy, and again and again. And I like the two commentators if they would seek to see the whatever kinship there may be in opposite between, let us say, Mencken on the one hand and Mises on the other.
You first. I was sick that week.
Well, it's to begin with, it's interesting and good that you mentioned Notes on Democracy. Mencken didn't like that book, but he didn't like it for idiosyncratic personal reasons. I think it's maybe the most underrated of his important books, and I spent some time on it in The Skeptic for this reason exactly. I think its defect, and this is something that PJ was alluding to earlier, its defect is that Mencken provides a brilliant critique of the problem of popular democracy, but at least in the compass of this book, and we know because we read the rest of his work as well, nowhere else does he really attempt to construct any kind of possible alternative to democracy. He simply spends this short and brilliant book telling us very brilliantly how dreadful democracy is, but he hasn't thought through the alternatives. I am not an economist, so I really can't shed any light on the differences or similarities between Mencken and Mises.
Mencken was himself a terrible economist.
Utterly.
He didn't really understand economics at all. But I think there's a couple things that's always important when we criticize people for having views that we find abhorrent today, for having those views in the past. This is not to necessarily excuse the views, but there is an anachronism in applying modern knowledge to past thought. I don't think it was not really fully evident until after World War II, and perhaps not really until the end of the 50s, or maybe even later than that, that there really was no alternative to democracy. there was a feeling among many intellectuals in the middle of the previous century that there must be some better idea, some more technocratic idea, some less sloppy, some less corrupt, some less foolish idea for governance. And the experience that we have had in how things have worked out for democratic nations versus how they have worked out for nations that have had other systems, alternative systems, has proven to us, it is crystal clear to us in 2002 that the alternatives to democracy are awful. It is not so crystal clear to a person in the 20s and 1930s. Also, when we go back to a person as old as Mencken was, at the time of his education, it was not known that the racial theories of those days were completely horseshit. It simply wasn't known. People didn't know. They thought they may have agreed or disagreed with the theories, but they thought there was some basis for the theories. And we know now from our scientific study and from our genetic study that there's no basis to them whatsoever, that the variations in DNA within a so-called race are greater than they are between the races, that these are meaningless social constructs. But that was not known back then. And so to criticize a person for taking racial theories seriously, you may criticize their unkindness, their injustice, their bigotry indeed, but to criticize them simply on the face of it for taking racial theories seriously is an anachronism. And so a lot of Mencken has to be read with the thought that this guy was born a long time ago. He would be, what, 122 years?
That's right.
122 years old if he were alive.
I would take this opportunity to point out, this is one of the things that I try to do in my book, to put Mencken in historical perspective. And as regards the question of race, to me, the interesting thing about Mencken is not that he thought the sorts of things that one might have expected a person born in Baltimore in 1880 to have thought, but that he published the writings of blacks like James Weldon Johnson and George Schuyler in the American Mercury, and indeed had them to dine at his house, his home in Baltimore. There are things about him you can't excuse, but you must take everything about him in historical context, which is the problem with a lot of what we call the political correct commentary today, is that it is ahistorical and has no historical perspective at all.
There's also something that Trollope wrote in his autobiography, is that if you give a man a tool, he will use it as hard as he can. If a man's tool is words, his words will run away with him. And Mencken, who was a master of invective and a master of offense, given a chance to exercise the invective and give offense, was not one to shrink from the opportunity. He would use the tool as hard as he could, and so that there's always, I think, him as a person and him as a writer. I mean, the dancer in the dance, all that. He wrote towards the end of his life an hilarious piece about segregation on Baltimore tennis courts, where he gets into golf. He's on particularly marvelous ground. How the whole idea of taxpayers supporting golf and for any person of any color was absolutely marvelous to him.
Yeah, if I may adapt the punchline of a joke, which I certainly will not tell with a television camera here, the reason why Mencken wrote the way he did was because he could.
Question down here.
Bob Carlson, the American Civil Rights Union. How well did Mencken get along with his bosses that owned and edited the paper over all those years?
Well, eventually he became one of them. In the second half of his career at the Sun, Mencken sat on the board of the company that owned the Sun papers. He did not like being an editor, but he worked at one at intervals during his life, last of all when he subbed as the editorial page editor of the Sun in 1938. And he was the labor negotiator for the Sun in its negotiations with the newspaper guild, and was regarded as being extremely good at that and extremely fair at it. Some of the bosses were his friends. Paul Patterson, the publisher of the Sun papers, was one of his closest friends. But he wasn't the sort of person who reflexively sucked up to the bosses. That just wasn't his temper at all.
Question in the back.
Yeah, I'd like to, Tom Palmer from the Cato Institute, just comment that Mencken's Germanophilia in the context of the time was less destructive than that of a Herbert Crowley or all the progressives who went to Germany and brought back the PhD, one of the most destructive influences in American life.
And Mencken would have agreed with you about that. A man with no college degree.
I have a question about his attitudes towards prohibition then and now, because he was a vociferous opponent of prohibition. Do you think it was because of his great hatred of the puritanical forces who brought it about, his great love of beer, or was there an actual love of liberty that was involved in his opposition to prohibition?
BJ?
I think you have to put the three together. I mean, it was a real trifecta of an offensive law, for somebody who, is just as you describe him there. I think Mencken had there's a funny side to German. I'm about half German myself, and my mother-in-law was born and raised in Germany, and so I've seen a fair amount of Deutschphilia around, if I may mix foreign languages, in my own household. And there is a strange little suspected libertarian streak to the Germans. As long as you don't do things outdoors in such a way that it frightens the horses or offends the neighbors, or as long as people don't know what you're doing, it's okay. It's only what other people know that you're doing. And there's a considerable latitude of respect for private eccentric behavior. More so in the German culture, I think, than either the Irish or the Anglo-Saxon cultures, which tend to be more intrusive on one's private life and one's private thoughts. Germans are very rigid about their public behavior, but rather things that happen out of sight. And I think that Mencken had a streak of that. And back to a moment to the admiration and liking of Germany. This was a very common thing right down to the minute that we went to war, or right down to the middle of the First World War, at any rate, when the torpedoing started and so on. Germany was admired by people on the left for the various social programs, Social Security, workers' compensation, all that kind of stuff. It was admired by people on the right for being sort of a tidy and organized place. It was a brand new country. There was a kind of admiration in the 1890s or so for Germany that would be comparable to the early 60s admiration for emerging third world nations, for the way that everybody got all soppy and kumbaya about Indonesia and stuff, back in the early 60s. And I remember where I grew up in Ohio, it's a very German area, and I remember my history teacher in 8th grade saying she was a little girl during World War I, and she said she didn't know which side we were going to go in on until right at the last minute. She said, I remember being perplexed because she lived in such a German, and America is, Germans constitute perhaps, next to the Irish at any rate, the largest ethnic group in the United States. And so the attitudes that he had towards Germany were not so odd.
I have to add something, by the way, which is that as regards the consumption of beer and in nearly every other aspect of his life, Mencken talked a much better game than he played. He was really quite moderate in his habits. He's very funny about talking about when you should drink and what you should drink. This is all in the book. In his private life, he was an extraordinarily moderate, temperate, and even cautious person. This is the thing that surprised me most in getting to know him as a personality and writing about him, is that this utterly extravagant personality on paper was, in private life, a mama's boy.
And chewed more of those cigars than smoked them.
He sure did.
Because he was a lifelong asthmatic.
And a good thing, too, those filthy 5-cent jobs.
Question in the back.
I'm Gary Arlen, and you mentioned Mark Twain as the penultimate writer of the last half of the 19th century. Do you think that Mencken will last 100 years? 2 or 3 generations from now will venerate him as much as many venerate Twain 100 years later?
I hope so. I think they should. And we're pretty close to it now, you know. I mean, Mencken's earliest published writings that are still read and anthologized date from around 1908, 1910. He's coming up on the antique centenary. Not all of his work will last. He wouldn't have expected it to. He published, by his own reckoning, something like 5 million words of prose, and he knew that a great deal of it was ephemeral. But I have no doubt that the best of it will be regarded as classic. There's going to be a period of adjustment and acceptance because he is not taught at the present moment, but he is read and he is in print. And in this area, I think the market of culture will make the right decision.
Also, as I was saying in a little talk I gave, I think that he is such a core constituent of the modern tone. Early Mencken reads much more modern than late Twain, even though they overlap. He really has a fully modern tone, and it is the tone that a lot of journalists, a lot of people who write for periodicals, and a lot of people who write for newspapers and so on, really cut their teeth on this stuff. So it is very much, it's going to remain accessible to the reader for a long, long time.
That's right. But that's the thing that throws you off, because as I was saying earlier, he sounds contemporary, and he's not contemporary. You always have to keep that in mind when reading him. He did indeed create what I think to be the first great modern American prose style. But there's sometimes a discontinuity between the tone and the content.
Questions?
Aside from everybody, who were Mencken's greatest enemies?
Where to begin? Mencken himself, with the collaboration of the woman who became his wife, edited and published in 1928 a book called a Mencken, I'm not a Germanist, a Mencken Skimpflexikon, I think it would be pronounced, which was drawn from his scrapbooks and consisted entirely of things that had been written about him that were critical, to the point of absolute raving hysteria. And it really was a clean sweep. He was disliked by editorial writers in the Bible Belt, a phrase that he coined, by the way. He was disliked by the editorial writers of the New Republic at the time that the American Mercury came out. He had an extraordinarily wide range of enemies, and I don't really think you could single out too many people in particular, could you? Do you think? That's a tough one. But the book is terribly funny to read. It's out of print, but it can be found in libraries, and it took a very particular sort of fellow to edit that sort of book about himself, I think. He's quite proud of it.
Terry Teachout is author of The Skeptic, A Life of H.L. Mencken. It's published by HarperCollins, on the web at harpercollins.com. Next week on